All right, well, no pressure to deliver an entertaining talk. Thank you all so much for coming out on a Tuesday night to listen to us. I hope this spawns some conversation, and also I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk in more of a community setting about what we've been doing on the research side. You know, we are very honored when our findings are published in high-end medical journals, but that doesn't always help us to get the conversation out there to oftentimes the families and the patients whom we work with in the communities who likely could be empowered by information and to likely need it the most. So to kind of start off, and official disclosure side, I am right-handed, so I think this is where this is going to end up. Yep, left, the left side here. Or you're right, I should say, but a variety of funding sources for this. I am funded by the NIH and the Department of Defense over a variety of years to do these studies. And to kind of explain where this all started for us, so there's actually been a lot of work. We're not the only ones. I don't stand up here just by myself. I stand really on the shoulders of some incredible giants in the field. But a lot of work in combat brain injury has really taken the role of looking at imaging and clinical outcomes, mostly with single time points of evaluation. These are cross-sectional studies where clinicians are asking patients about exposures that have happened months or years prior. And there's still questions about how brain imaging characteristics and clinical outcomes might evolve or resolve over time following these exposures, and how they might impact the service member's long-term outcome. And our take on this has been through a collaborative effort with Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, which is the primary triage point for all combat medically evacuated casualties of war, and efforts at Kandahar and Camp Leatherneck in Afghanistan, directly in combat, and academic universities that we work in the United States, to really track patients following the exposure from the initial point in injury, in combat, following these injuries, and then follow them back and see where they're at a year and 5 years and now 10-year outcome. So for those who aren't familiar, a little statistical perspective just to kind of give you a flavor of who and what we know when we started, and to kind of say, you know, where we were at, what we don't know, and what we need to know. There's over 2.5 million service members who have deployed to recent conflicts, and when we say recent conflicts, we're talking about global war on terror, to Iraq and Afghanistan, and more than a third of those completed multiple deployments, a lot of exposure to combat. There are over 22 million service members and veterans from all previous service in world conflicts still living to this day. So this makes up a large portion of our US population. About a fifth of those individuals from recent conflicts have sustained at least one brain injury, and those from prior conflicts, it's actually a little less known. Part of this is because the clinical definition of mild traumatic brain injury and concussion has evolved so much over the years, and the thoughts are that, you know, previous reports just unfortunately are poorly underestimated, if anything. You have all heard about post-traumatic stress, but that's actually one piece of many types of mental health disorders that our service members are returning with. About a third of them are being diagnosed with various types of psychiatric conditions. And a sobering fact for many of us when we think forward is just the estimated cost of healthcare. It's been estimated that it'll likely near $1 trillion in recent years, and this may exceed this estimate if these number of complex cases continues to surpass these estimates year after year after year. So this is really in the bucket of public health concern on a broad scale. And for those of us who work in this field, an extremely sobering fact, and I am sad to say it is still true to this day, our current success rate of translating preclinical models to human clinical trials for traumatic brain injury is 0. We have failed over the years, and recently a good colleague of ours in neurosurgery at University of Minnesota took a close look at this to better understand what these were, what we were doing, what we thought we were going to find, and why we didn't find it, so that we actually do a better job going forward to serve our TBI patients. And it turned out of the 30 clinical trials that have been done, they all failed to find significant treatment effects, even though they were supported by extensive preclinical studies. So are we designing our trials wrong? Are we using the wrong tools? Did we somehow misinterpret the preclinical studies? And again, this comes at a big cost. The estimated of these trials alone is over $1 billion. And you know, private industry, grant funding, taxpayers deserve better than that. And I think with the advancement in technology that's occurred over the last 5 to 10 years, we absolutely are going to be doing better. The challenge in particular for mild traumatic brain injury, and a subset of mild TBI is in fact concussion. Concussions are a brain injury, is that I would challenge any clinician or medical student who's learning about this in the room to tell me with definitive confidence which one of these people has a brain injury, which one of them has PTSD, which one of them has both or none. Now, of course, a clinician would be taking an extensive history and talking to this person, but the diagnosis requires self-endorsement and self-report. And in particular with our service member population, there's often the likelihood to minimize symptoms in the moment to maintain their support of the service and the duty that they are providing. In the military, this actually isn't new. It's gaining ground. We talk about it a lot more now than we used to, but it's kind of old hat. If you go back through the medical literature, as early as World War I, there were actually written documents about British Expeditionary Force members who were reporting, headache and dizziness and nausea and sensitivity to noise and light without any signs of external head wounds. And that, plus a negative CT scan nowadays, would essentially get you a diagnosis of mild TBI or concussion. As early as the 1900s, and by 1915, we had paper after paper coming out about this concept of shell shock. And that, some of the classic symptom characteristics of this included fatigue, anxiety, depressive mood. And today, in a constellation of symptoms, this has now been recharacterized and called PTSD. So with all of this history, you would think that we'd be at a position to say who has TBI, who has PTSD quite definitively, but it's a little more complex than that. And I like to think of it like a Venn diagram. You can have TBI without PTSD, you can have PTSD without TBI, you can have both, you can have none. But the challenge really comes when you start looking at the actual symptom profiles that are currently utilized in describing what is a mild traumatic brain injury, what does characterize PTSD, and the fact that unfortunately this can be confounded by medications, and this doesn't often account for potentially confounding other mental health conditions. Many individuals who have PTSD may also meet clinical criteria for depressive disorders, anxiety, adjustment disorder, mood disorder, and others. So these are complex. In general, this concept is what has surrounded this idea of the invisible wounds of war. And I like this quote that says, just because someone doesn't have scars that you can see, doesn't mean they're not battling. And with mild TBI, that's one of the hardest things because people come back looking very similar to when they deployed, but they could be acting very differently. And it can be hard for them and for their families to understand. But we sought out to try to embrace the new advancements in technology to say, are these really invisible? Or have we just been using insensitive tools to visualize them? And from an imaging perspective, there's this catchphrase in brain injury about this clinical conundrum, that there's a type of pathology in the brain called traumatic axonal injury. And think of the axons in your brain like the wiring in your house. And that the wiring can get cut and the axons can get disconnected. And a lot of work has shown that axonal injury, diffuse axonal injury, is a contributor to cognitive dysfunction and now even mood disorders, mental health, behavioral health changes that can happen following TBI. But from an imaging side, it can be hard to really drill down into those, does this patient have injured axons? And some of the scenarios that arise are, an individual with mild traumatic brain injury who presents in the emergency department. The physician is concerned about TBI, so they go and have a CT scan. And the neuroradiologist takes a look at it, and the CT scan is completely normal. Is that patient lying? Or did we just miss it on the CT scan? Or is there something else that's going on? Are they impaired for some other reason? Or are they telling us that they're impaired because there's some medical legal concern? And a lot of times it can be very ambiguous. On the severe TBI side of the fence, there's also challenges there when you have a patient in poor clinical status because they can be groggy and foggy and seem like they're kind of in and out of consciousness for a variety of different reasons. And the question comes up, is that because of things like axonal injury, or is it because they're sedative drugs, or maybe they're intoxicated, or they might have significant injuries outside of the brain called extracranial injuries that are complicating the situation. Unfortunately, within imaging, our imaging modalities that we use for brain injury have really been optimized for the visualization of hemorrhage and ischemia. So blood products, and then also alterations in blood flow and alterations in the amount of oxygen content, and aren't directly assessing this thing that we think is so crucial for this population. So a quick crash course in neuroradiology when it comes to head injury. If you come into the emergency department in any major hospital in the United States, you're suspect for a head injury, you're likely going to get a CT scan. And in the context of traumatic brain injury, a CT scan really recognizes blood products. That's what we're looking for. And we're talking about mild TBI. It'll sometimes pick up these things called contusions. In more severe injuries, things are much more apparent, but we're talking specifically in these challenging mild TBI situations. Now, that recognizes blood, but that's due to the shearing of blood vessels. It's not actually looking at axons. If you go for an MRI scan, so a CT scanner uses radiation, an MRI scanner uses magnets. And if you go for an MRI scan, anybody who's been for an MRI scan will know, very similar to CT, you go in a tube, this machine makes some noise. The difference is that the machine's going to make different kinds of noise because with magnets, we can kind of exploit the magnets in different ways to get different kinds of pictures. And there's a compilation of pictures that you can take. And when we look at the brain trauma protocol at every major emergency department in the United States, some of the photos, the pictures that we're taking are examples like this. So there's a T2 weighted image shown here. And in the context of brain injury, what we're really using that for is to look at edema, which is like swelling, fluid accumulation, again, associated with, but not directly assessing this axonal injury. There's also these things like a T2 star image, nowadays most commonly an SWI, that also recognizes blood products, and does so just with greater sensitivity than CT. And then things like diffusion weighted imaging, where it'll recognize the global movement of water, but again, not directly assessing this pathology that we think is so important to brain injury. And diffusion weighted imaging is used a lot even like with stroke, and really has made a lot of headways with stroke, but stroke is not always similar in pathology to these traumatic brain injury situations. It's a type of brain injury, but different. When we compare CT and MRI, just purely talking about the diagnostic tools that are most commonly available in hospitals, we see some interesting things. And this is very elegant work that's been done by our colleagues. We participated in a multi-center study called Track TBI. This is Dr. Mukherjee and Dr. Yu, our colleagues at UCSF, where we took initially just shy of 700 brain injured patients from different hospitals, and then repeated this in a 3,000 brain injury patient cohort from 17 level 1 trauma centers throughout the United States. And when we compared the CT scan that was taken in the emergency department to the MRI scan that was collected within a few days afterwards, we saw an interesting trend, which was known in radiology, but not appreciated as much, especially when you're drilling down into these specific populations, in our case, brain injury, which is that across the board, that the MRI consistently identified much more lesion pathology consistent with brain injury than the CT scan did. And the most striking finding, and this has now been repeated in this larger 3,000 patient cohort, was that for mild TBI patients who had a normal head CT, somebody who said, gosh, I'm concerned you have a head injury, let's go get a CT scan. The CT scan is normal. A third of those individuals had lesions identified on MRI that were consistent with brain injury, just missed by CT. And so we know that the technology that is currently in play, specifically when we're talking about mild brain injury, is likely insensitive to all of the potential brain changes that are associated with these head injury exposures. And there's even situations where the MRI scan, the conventional imaging, can be normal. And we're still asking the question, how do we know? How can we say with definitive confidence this person had a head injury? And that's where some of the newer technology comes in. There is an approach called diffusion tensor imaging, and this is something that we sought out to utilize and test out with our combat concussion patients. It builds off of that diffusion weighted imaging I was telling you about that's used often with stroke. And it essentially takes the concept of water moving throughout the brain, and does a little bit more than just care about the bulk movement. It cares about the direction of the movement as well. And so the example we often give is that if you took a drop of dye and you drop that dye in a cup of water, you'd see it kind of move all over the place. It diffuses randomly. And the mathematicians will tell you that can be modeled as what's called Brownian motion, the random walk. But if you took that same drop of dye and dropped it onto a stalk of celery, and I bring up celery because historically this is actually what they tested out, this technique in celery, your brain, it's about the same. But that on celery, you'll see, and actually we do this nowadays with kindergartners on Science Day, and they're just amazed. But you drop a drop of dye on celery, and you'll see that it's going to move more prevalently along the stalk of celery than kind of radiating out and perpendicular to it. Because it's path of least resistance, right? It goes down the tube, and it takes a while to get out through the walls. The wiring in our brain, the axons in our brain, essentially work the same way. And this is just a graphical depiction of what white matter with what's called a myelin sheath, think of it like insulation, has in our brain. And if we take a picture of that and we use this technique, we would see that the water would diffuse more prominently in one direction versus call it perpendicularly. And this has a term. It's called anisotropy. Everybody loves exciting terms. And so there's this effect, basically, this directional dependence of something to move in one direction more than the other. And why would we care about this for brain injury? Well, if we went in and had a pure simplified model where all we did was just sever the axon, right? We cut the celery stalk. Well, then the water is likely not going to diffuse as much down the axon because it's been cut, it's been severed, it's crushed. And so the directional dependence of that water will now move less prevalently along the axon versus perpendicular to it. And so you can imagine that there's a reduction in that kind of asymmetry effect. This looks much more ellipsoidal than this. And then in the converse, if all we did is go in and just strip off the insulation, right, path of least resistance, now there's not a barrier for water to diffuse out. And in fact, individuals who are studying disease states like multiple sclerosis are actually using this technique to try to better inform relapsing remitting MS, for example, or those with white matter lesions following extended viral load with HIV. They're using this as well to better understand how the brain, unfortunately, is being affected. That you'll see that the diffusion will then go out more so. It still's cruising along that tube that we talked about, but overall, that directional dependence, this nice tight ellipsoid, goes down and is reduced. And if in the very simplified version, both of those things happen, we end up with something where we take kind of the American football, and it looks more like the world's football, that we get a vast reduction in anisotropy. And again, why does this matter? Because fundamentally, we think that there is a sensitivity. For the math aficionados in the room, I put the equations here. I'm not going to walk through them because way too complex for a Tuesday night. Bless your hearts for even coming out for this talk. Goodness gracious, the last thing we want to do is go into complex math. But that said, when we compare the anisotropy with DTI versus like the diffusion weighted image that I was telling you about with stroke, fundamentally, this is the take home, which is in a mixed injury scenario or within the complexities that would happen following brain injury, there's a lot of things that are probably changing in the brain, and we know this is the case. So you can imagine that in one hand, we would see a vast reduction on this DTI signal that we're talking about. Now this math, I think we can all handle. It's 3 things added together, divided by 3. I think I can do this on a Tuesday night. And the bottom line is that depending on what went up and what went down, we could completely miss it. And that fundamentally, this is why newer imaging techniques like DTI, maybe, just maybe, will help us better inform things like traumatic brain injury. And so we sought to try that out. And it turned out that we had the opportunity to do this with the US military. And so the objective really of what's now been called the EVOLVE study, when you set out in science and medicine and you go to write grants and you create clinical trials and clinical research studies, they always ask, well, what's the title? What's the acronym? And none of us are trained in like flashy acronym design, but we worked hard to try to find something that would make sense. Behind the scenes, EVOLVE stands for Evaluation of Mild TBI, Long-Term Outcome in Active Duty U.S. Military and Veterans. Say that 5 times fast. So we just call it the EVOLVE study. But our objective really with this was to first and foremost test out this new imaging, but also do so in a way that would be clinically meaningful for the patient population that we're attempting to serve, which is to say we are going to look at imaging and clinical outcomes in mild concussive brain injury that's sustained during deployment. And we think that by leveraging, in particular, early clinical and imaging measures, that we can do a better job of predicting trajectories. I'm sorry to say, no 2 brain injuries are alike. That means that no 2 patients are alike. So anything that we're trying to group and say we can do this as a uniform thing for every patient is going to just inherently be limited. So by leveraging stuff early on, we can embrace this heterogeneity, and we can do so in a way that would be flexible to each patient's trajectory. This was the goal. And so the study design, there's a lot of words on this page, and the main take-homes are the following, which is to say that this is still a prospective, observational, longitudinal research study. So this is not intervention. We're not giving any drug, but we are trying out these new diagnostic tools in similar capacity and trying to understand the relationship with clinical outcome and with the diagnoses that these individuals were given over time. I want to be very clear that all the patients that we'll be talking about met the Department of Defense definition for mild, uncomplicated traumatic brain injury, which by definition is considered a concussion. These should be the mildest of the mild of everything that potentially people are sustaining in combat. So why am I, as a civilian, standing up here telling you about military combat trauma? Well, as luck would have it, we wrote these grants, started these collaborations, and the chief of trauma surgery at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center said, great, come on in, we're too busy, we can't help you, but if you want to come and do this, you can come on board, you can work with us, and away we went. So for 5 years, from 2008 to 2013, I, for a period of a month, 2 months at a time, lived and worked at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, seeing medically evacuated casualties of war. I was in trauma surgery there. Here I'm in neurological surgery. And then I'd go back to the United States to try to catch these folks 6 to 12 months later, and then I'd go back again and rinse and repeat over time. And you'll see that there's a few flavors of patient groups up on this slide, and there's a few points of starting. So the first point of starting is Landstuhl. Now these are medevac casualties, and the reason we went to Landstuhl, it was the closest MRI scanner to the combat theater at time when we started. We've decided to focus on blast traumatic brain injury because at the time, blast TBI was getting a lot of press, and everybody was very concerned about whether or not blast TBI as a mechanism might be different than other forms of traumatic brain injury. Would we need to have a blast TBI clinic, specific treatments for blast TBI, distinct from other forms of head injury? And decisions were starting to be made without actually good evidence-based support for them. We said we should look at this. Importantly, there's also controls in this group as well. And these are individuals where they did not have a head injury, and a subgroup of them actually had blast exposure. And so what's a blast control? It gave us an opportunity to study subconcussive events. So people who came into Landstuhl and were screened for head injury, determined to not have a head injury by the neurology clinic, but had blast exposure. And this is similar to subconcussive exposures that you hear about in different forms of athletics. In the case of combat, this was a version and a very common mechanism. And then we actually had individuals who had a head injury that were not from blast, and they didn't have a history of being blown up, so that we could compare head-to-head this question of mechanism. And importantly, we got a lot of flack about the fact, well, you know, these are medically evacuated individuals, that's a biased sample, that's not representative of the deployed force who gets injured, so many of them still stay in theater. Well, as luck would have it, in 2012, Lieutenant Commander Octavian Adam, who was deploying to the combat theater at the time, reached out to us and said, hey, you know, they're deploying MRI scanners to Afghanistan. There's going to be 3 of them. I was in Germany at the time, and he said, you know, can we work together? And I said, yep, terrific. Let's make this work. And so we were then provided the opportunity to actually evaluate and scan individuals in combat. And we did this at Camp Leatherneck and Kandahar Airfield over a period of about 18 18 months, starting in 2012. And that allowed us a couple things. One, the opportunity to look at individuals who were not medically evacuated with blast exposure, again, these more mild injuries, and two, to have the comparison, medevac versus non-medevac. Okay, let's compare them head to head, and let's see what they look like. And then we had the opportunity to follow them out to a year, and then follow them out to, we just finished our 5-year follow-up. And you will note that on here, there are actually individuals at this time point under each arm that are showing as deceased. And every single one of those is from suicide -1. That was an accident. No one was over the age of 45. And so we are working very hard to do a better job of that as well and better understand that. But the basic flow was essentially you come through Kandahar, for example, or Landstuhl, you're going to get imaged, and then you're followed out. Between the 1-year and 5-year follow-up, I made the very confusing transition from Washington University in St. Louis to the University of Washington in Seattle. I still screw that up to this day, so my apologies to my colleagues and esteemed colleagues here. Wash you wash. Someday I'll get it. That said, at the later time points, we were able to scan them and also at this point evaluate with a battery of neurological, psychological, as well as a cognitive test battery that I'll show you on this slide. And I have to say, on an aside, I'm so proud of our patient coordination team. Since the beginning, we're just getting folks as they're coming in, multiple flights a day into Landstuhl, all the casualties screening through, we're rounding, the folks in Afghanistan, it was whoever we got. That meant that when people came back to the United States, they could come back to anywhere. And since the 1-year follow-up, we actually maintain patients in the study in all 50 states, 2 U.S. territories, and it bounces between 9 and 11 countries. And so I have incredible pride for my patient coordination team who stays in contact with folks, works with them, and then for each of these follow-ups, they're physically flying in to see us, oftentimes traveling with a caretaker because they cannot travel alone at this point. So the stuff that never makes it to publications, but I just really want to acknowledge their incredible support and talent that they've provided over the years. So these are the neuropsych assessments for anybody who's in psych or neuropsych. Yep, they're pretty common assessments that are done in rehab clinics for traumatic brain injury. So for those of you who are still awake or not checking your cell phone, this is the entire slide of conventional imaging findings we found in this group. I hope you're going, wait, what am I missing? There were none. And that's precisely what we thought we would see because these were concussion folks. But the point is that all of the CT, all of the MRI scans, all the conventional imaging to show any indication of brain injury was normal. There were no abnormalities identified by boarded neuroradiologists who examined the scans and provided a radiological report for interpretation. That said, when we looked with DTI, we actually found something. And we found evidence with these newer imaging methods that was consistent with traumatic brain injury. And these are group findings, and we all do this. We publish, and you can see that I've published this too, group findings with these methods. But at the end of the day, clinician is not going to be looking at a group of patients. They're going to be looking at one patient and having to make a decision about that single patient sitting in front of them. And so it was very important and very rewarding to us to be able to say, you know what? These imaging findings are also being able to distinguish these patients on a single subject level. That even with these heterogeneous brain injuries, no two brain injuries are alike, this technique, not only did we see the normal group stuff, but we saw stuff that actually helped even for a single patient sitting in front of us. And importantly, when we look at the early scans versus the 1-year scans, approximate 1-year scans later, we're seeing an evolution, not resolution of these abnormalities. Because the argument can be made, well, you have an abnormality, it was just because of something pre-existing. It was an injury years ago. Well, then it should have been stable, and it wasn't. And this really supported the fact that this is likely from a more recent exposure. Now, I stand up here to tell you all about imaging, but I have to say, I really don't care about imaging unless it actually helps inform the patient that's sitting in front of me. And for that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the information that we identified with all of the measures of clinical outcomes and what did these folks look like? And does the imaging even relate to clinical outcomes? So for that, we'll start with the 1-year. At 1-year follow-up, we were quite surprised. This is global disability data. Again, remember, these across 4 independent cohorts are mild concussive traumatic brain injury. And those percentages are the number of patients across every cohort that met the clinical criteria from moderate to severe disability. It should also be noted that the control groups themselves are not immune, but importantly, that the BLAST group and the non-BLAST TBI group, there was no difference. The also striking thing for us was the fact that the medically evacuated cohort didn't actually statistically differ from the non-medically evacuated cohort. This was really surprising to us. How can the non-medically evacuated cohort be doing, quote, so poorly? They've never been followed over time, which just wasn't something that had been looked at. But here we are able to provide, for the first time, some direct comparisons. Importantly, I also provide the percentage of individuals from a large-scale, multi-center brain injury study looking at mild TBI and TBI with polytrauma. You see it's about a third of the group, and these percentages are much, much higher. Where is that coming from? A lot of it seemed to be driven by mental health. These are scales that are used. These are structured clinical interviews that were administered blinded to the clinical status. So we have a team that comes in, blinded to the clinical status of the patient. And you see that across the board, the red are the concussive blast folks. This pink fuchsia, I don't even know what to call it, is the non-blast TBI folks. And across the board, these guys are sitting much, much higher than the gray and black groups, which are the control groups. And so repeated across 4 independent cohorts over this 5-year period, because there's influxes in the war, there had been change in healthcare policy during this time, we're not seeing a dramatic improvement. We're seeing actually a significant mental health load on 2 primary measures. And again, no distinction by the type of exposure, blast or non-blast. Concussion in combat just wasn't so great. And importantly, again, that there is this almost step effect with the blast controls, the subconcussive group, versus the non-blast controls, again, repeated across the 2 cohorts of which they were collected. And so this also played out when we looked at what's called neurobehavioral impairment. It's a multi-domain clinical structured interview for a lot of different things that include irritability, disinhibition, many of kind of the symptom clusters that make up what we know about mild traumatic brain injury. And also headache frequency intensity was a big part of that as well. And so, this is a pretty significant load. And yeah, we got a lot of pushback. Oh, you must have done something wrong. Clearly there's something skewed about this particular population. And also that many of us, when we went through school and were trained, there was always this discussion about, traumatic brain injury, 6 to 12 months out is basically the vast majority of recovery, and then people are kind of stable over time. So at least that when you're counseling family members, you would say, you're about a year out. This is about the recovery you'll have. This is where you can start kind of figuring out where to go next. And so we asked the simple question of just, are these impairments, maybe they were just resolve. Maybe there's just something about that first year that, it's just kind of a delay effect. Or are they sustained over time? And so with the 5-year follow-up, one of the beauties, although there's some painful logistical moments of trying to follow somebody literally around the world, and 500 of them for that matter, so there's very humbling experiences behind the scenes here. But to truly do that was really eye-opening, which was we were able to compare that same person over time, and we were seeing again these reductions in this new imaging method, again at the group level, not a lot of no significant volume changes. So this is important because it wasn't just that these people's brains, the patient's brains were atrophying, meaning like dying away. This was the microstructural stuff, which meant that the conventional imaging still looked normal. And importantly, with imaging, we asked the question at 5 years, did they get better? Did they get worse? How were their brains looking? We were quite surprised to see when we went in and looked at the anatomical abnormalities using DTI that 74% of these patients had reductions in this anisotropy measure, now indicative of chronic brain injury. That not only is it not stable, in a large proportion of these folks, things are changing, things are evolving, not just their outward appearance, but in their brains too. And so when we did ask that question that I started with, which does the imaging actually help inform the patient? The answer was a resounding yes. And that is to say that we did this intentionally because DTI is something that cannot be done everywhere. And it can be difficult to actually get stable measures unless you are following somebody very carefully and you get into all the technical weeds. So we said, can we be informed by this, and can we come up with something that's useful no matter where folks are at that any provider could utilize? And the answer was, if all we had was the early data, we could predict with about 80% accuracy where somebody was, what their brain basically was going to look like 5 years later, if we just knew their TBI diagnosis, their age at injury, their depression load, and then 2 measures of cognitive performance, reaction time, and what's called verbal fluency. And this is important to us because although we started with this kind of fancy schmancy imaging, the reality of what we do is the hope is that there would be an ability to impact care everywhere. And I think a lot, even about where I came from, a very poor farming community in Northern California, and I think about my neighbors and how how can this help them now? I don't want to help them 30 years from now. I want to help them now. And this information can be used by any clinician, even without the imaging, but it also really drove home the point that yes, this imaging is helping us inform what's happening to these folks. At 5 years, as we said at 1 year, the global disability wasn't so hot. And we thought, gosh, we were getting all these critiques, oh, it's wrong, or oh, these people are still going to recover. Great, let's look at them at 5 years, hoping that everybody's going to be better. Not only were they not better, 72% of the blast patients experienced a substantial decline. They got worse. And so this mantra about 6 to 12 months and stable, 6 to 12 months and stable, is really challenged in this population. And it turns out that there are large-scale efforts in moderate to severe brain injury that have reported the same thing. A large group called TBI Model Systems is saying the same thing, but no one has ever looked in mild TBI, and no one certainly had ever looked in military service members. And so, again, we were quite surprised. This is a very busy slide, but there's a couple take-homes to be aware of, which is to say that the PTSD symptoms, the depression symptoms, the anxiety, and in particular, this poor sleep seem to be a chronic impairment for a lot of individuals with these combat concussion exposures, even when we compare them to all the grays or everybody that deployed right along with them. They just didn't have the head injury. Interestingly, from Vietnam head injury study, people look a lot at alcohol. So this is the alcohol data. There actually is not a difference in the group as far as alcohol misuse or abuse, at least at this point, 5 years out. And in fact, the entire total load, the dot line here, indicates where you would actually be concerned. There's only a handful of folks, very few that cross over that line. And so we're seeing that there's this significant elevation of these mental health symptoms. And interestingly, when we ask the very simple question, because we got these critiques all the time, well, it's because the service members are doing bad because they're just not asking for help. Okay, well, let's ask that question. And in almost 350 of these patients, at 5 years, we asked that question. We went through the structured interview about, did you seek mental health services? What was it? Did you complete treatment? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What did you do? What medications were you on? And we found that 80% of the patients endorsed seeking mental health symptoms, and this was the group that had to have completed the treatment. But when we asked about sustained resolution, only 19% said it actually helped. That means that we're failing a lot of patients with traditional psychiatric treatment strategies. And where is that coming from and why? Well, that's where we think the brain injury might be contributing. It's not the whole story. And the imaging that we're now doing is able to inform now when we get down to the networks in our brains that are involved in emotional regulation and mood control, that maybe, just maybe, that might be part of the factor here. So again, we see a lot of neurobehavioral symptom load and sustained headache frequency and intensity. What you'll probably be asking yourselves is, wait, didn't you say you did all this cognitive testing? Like, where's the cognitive data? Turns out, when we compared them head-to-head at every single time point across every single cohort, there was no difference in cognitive performance across the groups in comparison to the controls. People are talking about, I have memory deficits, I have attentional deficits, but when you actually test them on standardized neuropsych testing, there's no difference in the groups. And what we're left with are the neurobehavioral issues, the somatic issues, the mental health issues, and that seems to be influencing disability, and also the sleep. And so then we ask the question, again, building upon this concept of not only do we want to be able to help those who can make it to level 1 trauma centers and do fancy schmancy imaging, but for the rural clinics, for the combat austere environments that many of our casualties were coming in from, what could be done, what could be utilized, what was there at the time that could inform these trajectories just for the clinical decision making with these patients, because medevacing somebody out of combat doesn't come without risk. It's a big decision to do that. And it turned out that with 92% confidence, we could tell where someone was going to be for global disability 5 years later from a few pieces of information early on. And that was, again, TBI diagnosis, neurobehavioral symptoms, and just 3 measures of cognitive performance. And that is something that can be used now, even though we're rooted in the imaging, we're rooted in the fact that we're able to say with greater certainty there are changes that are indicative of head injuries. The fact that there is something we can do about it now, we think is really important. And we've been working with DoD policymakers to actually change policy around this. And they've even altered the care of concussion in combat from work that we've done and from other individuals that we submitted data for a congressional hearing, which is a unique opportunity for myself. Many folks get into research and they go, yeah, this will impacting patients in the next generation, 30 to 40 years from now. And our goal in this was to kind of flip that on their head and say, no, we should care about the patients now. We should care about the survivors that are out there now. What could we be doing better? So I'm going to quickly summarize for you kind of what we've talked about. This has been a huge data dump. There's a lot of information here, decades plus of work in 25 minutes. Of course, everybody gets it. And then I'll spend about 10 to 15 minutes on a couple of closing thoughts and some of the new work we've been doing. So what I've showed you, and I've hoped I've convinced you, is that newer imaging potentially can help. And in our case, it consistently identified abnormalities that are suggestive of brain injury, both in combat, following medevac, at 1 year, and at 5-year outcome. And we've just started the 10-year wave very recently. And that combat concussion appears to worsen global outcome, again, over time, and that there's something about these exposures that is exacerbating symptoms of mental health. And we've observed this repeatedly across all 4 independent cohorts that were examined over the years. And so these are kind of important points of comparison. As I told you, one of the questions that was kind of the burning question which we started, which was, there must be differences between non-medically evacuated patients and medically evacuated patients. And while absolutely there is, in regards to clinical outcome profile at 1 year and 5 years down the line, there wasn't. That also held true for blast and non-blast concussion at the 1-year follow-up, and we're starting to look at that 5-year follow-up data. And while on one hand that can seem really, disappointing and saddening, on the other, that's actually really powerful, because that means that we don't have to come up with blast-specific treatments. We don't have to figure out blast-specific or blast plus versus non-blast, that if we do have treatments for traumatic brain injury at large for our combat service members, and they do sustain a concussion, that it can be applied across the board. And that surprisingly, there was a difference in these blast-exposed controls versus the non-blast-exposed controls, this subconcussive group. This is important because right now, clinically, those patients are lumped together. And this has a big bearing on when they separate from the service, their disability ratings. It has a direct impact on them and their lives. And this just resounding finding that, the vast majority of these patients did seek assistance for mental health. It is not for lack of trying. They are using the programs. It's just that they're not getting sustained resolution, and that we need to do a better job of focusing in on patient-specific strategies. This is not a one-size-fits-all. It's complex. And unfortunately, that there was an evolution, not resolution, when we carefully followed the very same patient over time, from the point of combat to 1 year and then to 5 year. And I would submit to you that these findings, really do suggest a greater impact of these seemingly mild concussion exposures than previously appreciated. And actually, this has a very important implication when we start thinking about the millions of service members out there as the population ages. So a few closing thoughts in the next 5 to 10 minutes. I tried to hit all of the disclaimers. This is not the opinion of my funders, not the UW School of Medicine, not the opinion of my husband, our dog, our family, just my personal opinion. So if you're going to throw the rotten tomatoes, I deserve them, not these amazing folks. In my line of the work, this is what I hear. Although people complain about, I cannot remember, I hear remembering is easy, it's forgetting, it's the hard part. They want to hold on, but also they're worried about forgetting. And that, unfortunately, for many service members coming back, the battle actually isn't over. The war has just begun. There's fights that have just begun, that as they and their families and their friends and their children attempt to adjust to kind of a new normal, as people call it, and adjust to the clinical outcomes following brain injury. And unfortunately, it's not even, okay, have this figured out. It's, unfortunately, what we're seeing is you might have it figured out, but then there's things that are happening, and people are getting worse and getting better and getting worse and getting better. And in our line of the work, for many, the real battle is unfortunately lost, for far too many. This was published a few years ago. This actually was just re-reported this year and reconfirmed almost every hour, 65 minutes. It's actually just shy of 65 minutes, to be precise. A service member or veteran commits suicide. And the afternoon picnic with one spouse, giving mom or dad a hug, takes on a whole cold new meaning. And we should be able to do better for this population. Serve those who serve us is kind of where we come in. And this has led us to work. This started a few years ago when we started losing individuals to suicide, teamed up with my neuropath colleagues to try to understand this at a more fundamental level. We're talking about these imaging changes, but what does the actual brain tissue look like? If we're going to hit a drug target, we need to understand what's really there and understand the pathology underneath the hood. And so we have tried hard to learn from these tragedies, and the family members, even some service members themselves, agree in life that they'd like to donate their brain at the time of death, and we will accept those brains. It's one of the ultimate gifts, an incredible generous gift that people give to research, to the next generation. We have family members say, please, if you can find anything to help anybody, it's worth it. And this is one of the cases we've now, unfortunately, had over 100 cases that have come to autopsy that we've examined in this way, where we've in fact actually linked the imaging that we've had. Antemortem just means in life. So we linked the imaging and the clinical outcomes that we have in these patients to postmortem imaging, meaning after the brain is procured, we do a high-resolution imaging approach, and then we actually utilize that to do what's called image-guided tissue sectioning for neuropathological research. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the neuropathologists, when they're looking at the tissue slabs, can't see everything that we can see on imaging, and vice versa. They can see things that we cannot. But by working together, we are able to get a more comprehensive appreciation of the underlying injury that has occurred. And this is where, because brain injury is a heterogeneous disease, meaning it can be anywhere in the brain, this helps us into very quickly strategically focus where we should look. And it's not just even postmortem imaging, it's by linking back to the scans that we had in somebody in life that we're able to find interesting indications of pathology that help explain what happened to somebody. This was a case of a young man who committed suicide in mid-20s after repeated head injury exposures. And it actually was on the MRI scan that was collected 3 years prior to death, where we see this dark blob that is indicative of blood product. And only by alignment to the postmortem imaging and then to the tissue slabs, I was able to tell my neuropath colleagues, we go in, got everything laid out, you want to look here. I know this looks normal and there's nothing about this that, you would think otherwise, but you should look here because, years ago, this person had an injury, and we do this throughout the entire brain. And it turns out, for example, in this case, and this is now rung true a variety of times over and over, by doing so, and they go in microscopically and look, they see evidence of brain injury pathology, and in this particular young man's case, evidence of tau pathology. And it was because of this that he actually was given the diagnosis of low-stage chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It would have been missed by traditional neuropath methods, because they have to decide up front, we're going to look at this region, and this region. it's not flexible to brain injury. And they know this, but they have no good way to go in and try to better strategically section. And so by teaming up, we've been able to really shed light on also what we call pathophysiological underpinnings of these exposures. So where does this leave us? Well, I would say this is an opportunity for us to act now. And one of the things that's unique about the military and prior conflicts is that the way that the healthcare delivery system is set up, it's more essentially kind of like a universal healthcare delivery system where everybody that's active duty has a certain kind of healthcare system databases basically that you can go back and look at, and then veterans they don't have to, but the vast majority of them will apply for VA benefits, and so there's VA healthcare information as well. And it turns out that again, learning from lessons learned. Learning from prior conflicts and exposures. When we go back even World War I, World War II, and Vietnam, the last time it was checked, it turns out that the peak disability payout, the compensation, the cost, the healthcare cost, doesn't peak until decades down the line. And if we assume global war on terror ended in 2014, and will potentially near $1 trillion in coming years, the true cost to these current conflicts on not just our servicemen and women, but on our children, on our children's children, I humbly believe is yet to be appreciated. Do keep in mind, on one hand, it's extraordinary, the service members have decades of life to live out, and we hope those are amazing, good quality years, but oftentimes they are challenged with brain injury and mental illness, among other disabilities. Keep in mind that's not just the whole story. And while mortality rates have decreased, meaning the number of deaths, meaning we can keep the heart beating under very austere conditions. I was actually in Landstuhl when one of the quadruple traumatic amputations came through, and he survived, and he's thriving, actually, still to this day. But morbidity rates, the things that happen after the events, have just exponentially grown. And so our focus, we believe, really should be on quality of life. This is not about survivability. We got survivability, under control versus minus a very small % of the population. And importantly, quality of life as this population ages. This is dating me a little bit, but years ago there was a sign over the LA County Public Health Department that said, it read, "Prevention is caring, curing is costly." And I would submit to you, early intervention is caring is costly. By helping that service member, you're not just helping them, you're helping their family, you're helping their kids. And this brings down the personal cost, the family cost, and importantly for any of you in the room, the public health and societal costs. With that, I'd like to say thank you so much for your time. I don't stand up here by myself. I have an amazing team of individuals literally around the world that I've had the opportunity to work with through these studies. Everybody with letters in front of their name are active duty folks, and even individuals out here who are government contractors, meaning we could not pay them at all for this. They literally did this because they believed in it and thought it was going to be helpful. In Landstuhl, I always tell folks, when you come through the ED in Landstuhl, there's a sign, the motto of Landstuhl is actually selfless service, and I felt that day in and day out, and I feel like that's where we are now, which is we have a duty and an opportunity and a responsibility to serve those who have served us, and this is our way of contributing back. So I will stop there, and I think we have time for some questions. Okay. Thank you so much for your time.